The Little Princess of Tower Hill, Chapter 12. In the Wood. The little Princess of Tower Hill and the child of the poor laundress were both pronounced out of danger. Death no longer with its terrible sickle hovered over this pretty flower. They were to make beautiful the garden of earth for the present. Waters felt quite sure in her own heart that she, under God, had been the means of saving Maggie's life, for Maggie had smiled so sweetly and contentedly when Waters had brought her back the other child's message, and after that she had ceased to speak about meeting Joe in heaven. When the scales were turned and the children were pronounced out of danger, they both grew rapidly better, and at the end of the fortnight Maggie was able to sit up for a few minutes at a time, and almost to fatigue those about her with her numerous inquiries about Joe. Every day Waters went to the hospital and came back with reports of the sick child, whose progress towards recovery was satisfactory, only not quite so rapid as Maggie's. At last the doctor gave Sir John and Lady Ascot permission to take their little darling back to Tower Hill. Mrs. Grenville accompanied her brother and sister and little niece, and of course in the country Maggie would have that great happiness of meeting Ralph again. Ralph by this time had taken the hearts of Miss Grey and the numerous servants at Tower Hill by storm. He was thoroughly at home and thoroughly happy, assumed a good deal the airs of a country autocrat, and had more or less his own way in everything. He was delighted to see Maggie and immediately drew her away from the rest to talk to her and consult her on various subjects. "You look rather white and peaky, Mag, but you'll soon be browned up now that you've got into the real country. You must run about a great deal and forget that you're very ill. You mustn't even mind being a little tottery upon your leg at first. I know you must be tottery, because I've been consulting Miss Grey about it, and she once had rheumatic fever, and she used to totter about after it awfully. But the great thing is not to be sentimental over it, but to determine yourself that you will get back to your muscles. Now, what do you think I have found? Come round with me into the shrubbery, and you shall see." Ralph's words were decidedly a little rough and tonicky, but his actions were more considerate, for he put his arm round his little cousin and led her quite gently away. Maggie found the sweet country air delicious. She was also very happy to feel Ralph's arm round her, and she could not help giving his little brown hand a squeeze. "Oh, Ralph, you don't mean Bianco and Lily?" "Yes, I mean my darling white beauties that Joe gave me. I found them again in the wood, and they have grown as friendly as possible, and I don't shut them up in my hutch. They live in the wood, and they come to me when I call them. Yesterday I found them. They had made a nest, and the nest was full of little bunnies, all snow white, and with long hair like the father and mother. I'm going to show you the nest now." At that moment of this delightful sight, Maggie's cheeks became very pink, and her eyes danced, and she forgot that her legs were without muscle, and even tried to run in her excitement and pleasure. "Don't be silly, Mag," laughed her cousin. "The bunnies aren't going to hide themselves, and we'll find them all in good time. You may walk with those tottery legs of yours, but you certainly cannot run." The children found the nest of lovely white rabbits and spent a very happy half-hour sitting on the ground gazing at them. Then Maggie began to confide a little care which rested on her heart about Joe to her cousin. "She has got well again, you know, Ralph, and I promised she would meet me in the country somehow, where the grass is green, and yet I don't know how she's to come. I have got no money, and Joe has got no money, and father and mother don't say anything about it. It would be a dreadful thing for Joe to stay away from heaven, for she was very, very near going to heaven, Ralph, and then to find that I had broken my word to her, and that after all we were never to see each other where the grass is green." "It would be worse than dreadful," answered Ralph. "It would be downright cruel and wicked. Dear little Jo, she'd like to come here and look at the bunnies, wouldn't she? Well, I've got no money either, and she can't be got into the country without money. That I do know. Perhaps I'd better speak to Mother about it." But Ralph, when he did question Mrs. Grenville on the subject, found her wonderfully silent, and in his opinion unsympathetic. She said that she could not possibly interfere with Sir John and Lady Ascot in their own place, and that if she were Ralph, she would let things alone, and trust to the Ascots doing what was right in the matter. But Ralph was not inclined to take this advice. "I like Maggie for being good about Jo," he said, "and Jo shan't be disappointed. I'll go myself to Uncle John. He probably only needs to have the thing put plainly to him." Sir John listened to the little boy's somewhat excited remarks with an amused twinkle in his eye. "So the princess has sent you to me, my lad," he said. "You tell her to keep her little mind tranquil, and to try to trust her old father." Little Jo came very slowly back to health and strength, but at last there arrived a day when the hospital nurse pronounced her cured, and when her mother arrived with a cab to take her away. The hospital nurse had tears in her eyes when she kissed Jo, and the other sick children in the ward were extremely sorry to say good-bye to her. Poor little Jo, without making any extraordinary efforts, indeed, without making any efforts at all, had a wonderful faculty for inspiring love. No doubt she was sympathetic, and no doubt also she was self-forgetful, and her ready tact prevented her saying the words which might hurt or doing the deeds which might annoy, and these apparently trivial traits in her character may have helped to make her popular. On that particular sunshiny afternoon, the preparations made by certain excited little people in Filmar's building were great. From the day Jo was pronounced out of danger, Susie had begun to recover her spirits, and at any rate to forgive herself for her conduct in the matter of the tambourine. She had not spent any of the 7 shillings which the pawnbroker had given for poor Maggie's best hat. It had all been securely tucked away in her best white cotton pocket-handkerchief, and neither her mother nor the boys knew of its existence, for to purchase a tambourine while Jo was so ill and Maggie supposed to be dying was beyond even thoughtless Susie's desire. After her own fashion, this rather heedless little girl had suffered a good deal during the past weeks, and suffering did her good, as it does all creatures when taken well. Now, while the boys were very busy getting the room into a festive condition for Jo, Susie quietly and softly withdrew 1 shilling from her mysterious hoard and went out to make a purchase. A shilling means almost nothing to some people. They spend it on utter rubbish. They virtually throw it away. This was, however, by no means the case with Susie. She knew a shilling's worth to the utmost farthing, and it was surprising with what a number of parcels she returned home. "Now, Ben and Bob, we'll lay the tea-table," she said, addressing her excited little brothers. "Yer put the cloth straight, do. You know as Jo can't abide nothing crooked. Now then, out comes the fresh loaf as Mother's brought. Pop it on the cracked plate, and put it here, a little to one side. It looks more genteel. Not right away in the very middle. Here goes the teapot. Oh my! Ain't it a pity as the spout is cracked off? And here's the little yeller jug for the milk. Here's butter too. Dust, but not bad. Now then, We begins on my purchases. A slice of on this tiny plate for Joe, red herrings, which we'll toast up and make piping hot presently. A nice little bundle of radishes. Oh, my hays, I do like cresses. They're so nice and biting. Now then, what'll we hear? Why, a big packet of lollipops. I got the second quality of lollipops, so as quite a big parcel, and the man threw in 2 over, 'cause I said they were for a gal just out of the hospital. Shrimps is in this 'ere bag. Now, boys, there ain't none of these 'ere for you. They're just for Mother and Joe, and no one else. Don't ye be greedy, Ben and Bob. For if you are, I'll give you something to remember. Here's a real fresh egg, which must be boiled. That's for Joe, of course. And there's a penny's worth of dandelions to stick in the middle of the table. Here they goes into this old brown cracked jug. And don't they look fine? Well, I'm sure I never did see a more genteel board. The boys thoroughly agreed with Susie on this point, and while they were skipping and dancing about and making many dives at the tempting eatables, and Susie was chasing them with loud whoops, half of anger and half of mirth, about the room, Mrs. Almar and the little pale, spiritual-looking sister arrived. At the sight of Joe, and the children felt their undue excitement. Subsiding, their happiness became peace, as it always did in her blessed little presence. There was no wrangling or quarreling over the tea-table. The look of pretty Joe laying on her sofa once again kept the boys from being over-greedy, and reduced Susie's excitement to due bounds. Mrs. Almar said several times, "I'm the weary happiest woman in London," and her children seemed to think that they were the happiest children. The pleasant tea hour came, however, to an end at last, and Susie was just washing up the cups and saucers and putting the remainder of the feast into the cupboard, when the whole family were roused into a condition of most alert attention by a sharp and somewhat imperative knock on the room door. "Dear heart alive!" exclaimed Mrs. Almar. "Whoever can that be? It sounds like the landlord, only I paid my bit of rent yesterday. It's more likely to be someone after you as laundress, Mother," remarked practical Susie. And then Ben flew across the room and opened the door wide, admitted no less a person than Sir John Ascot himself. Mrs. Almar had never seen him, and of course did not know what an important visitor was now coming into her humble little room. Susie, however, knew Maggie's father, and felt herself turning very white, and took instant refuge behind Joe's sofa. "Now, which is little Joe?" said Sir John, coming forward and peering round him. "I've come here specially today to see a child whom my own little girl loves very much. I've something to say to that child, and also to her mother. My name is Ascot, and I dare say you all, good folks, have heard of my dear little girl Maggie." "Miss Maggie!" exclaimed Joe, a delicate pink coming into her face, and her sweet violet eyes becoming not tearful but misty. "Are you Miss Maggie's father, sir? I seems to be near Miss Maggie somehow." "So you are, little lassie," said the baronet, and then he glanced from pretty Joe to the other children, and from her again to her mother, as though he could not quite account for such a fragile and pure little flower among these plants of sturdy and common growth. "My little Joe favors her father, Sir John," said Mrs. Almar, dropping a profound curtsy and dusting a chair with her apron for the baronet. "We're all pleased to see you here. pleased and proud, and that's not saying a word too much. And how is the dear, beautiful little lady, Sir John? And Master Ralph, bless him? My little girl is well again, thank God, Mrs. Almar. And Ralph is as sturdy a little chap as any heart could desire. Yes, I will take a seat near Joe, if you please. I've a little plan to propose, which I hope she will like, and which you, Mrs. Almar, will also approve of. This is it." Then Sir John unfolded a deep-laid plot, which threw the Almar family in a state of unspeakable rapture. To describe their feelings would be beyond any ordinary pen. Chapter 13. Thank God for all. On a certain lovely evening in the beginning of September, when the air was no longer too warm, and the whole world seemed bathed in absolute peace and rest, little Maggie Ascot and her cousin Ralph might have been seen walking, with their arms round each other in very deep consultation. Maggie was quite strong again, had got her roses back, and brought light of health in her blue eyes. She and Ralph were pacing slowly up and down a shady path not far from the large entrance gates. "I can't think what it means," exclaimed Maggie. "It is the 4th time Aunt Violet has gone up there today," said Susie. "The scullery maid has gone with her now, carrying an enormous basket. Susan, let me peep into it, and it was full of all kinds of goodies. She said it was for the new laundress. I never knew such a fuss to make about a laundress." Here Ralph thought it well to administer a little reproof. "That's because you haven't been taught to consider the poor," he said. "Why shouldn't a laundress have nice things done for her? If this is a poor lonely stranger coming from a long way off, it's quite right for Mother to welcome her. Mother always thinks you can't do too much for lonely people, and she'll wash your dresses all the whiter if she thinks you're going to be kind and attentive. Why, Maggie, our little Joe's mother is a laundress. You forget that? Laundresses are most respectable people." At the mention of Joe's name, Maggie sighed. "There's nothing at all been done about her, Ralph," she said. "Nobody seems to take any notice when I speak about her. She must be tired of waiting and watching by this time. She must be dreadfully sorry that she did not go away to heaven and God, for she must now know that I never meant anything when I wanted to meet her in the country, and yet I did, Ralph, I did." Here Maggie's blue eyes grew full of tears. "Never mind, Mag," replied her little cousin soothingly. "It is very odd, and I don't understand it a bit, but Mother says things are sure to come right, and you know, Uncle John wished us to trust him." "But the time is going on," said Maggie. "The summer days will go, and Joe won't have seen the lovely country where the grass is green. Oh, Ralph, we must do something. If only Mrs. Almar were the new laundress," began Ralph. "You can't think what a nice cottage that is, Mag. 4 lovely rooms, and such nice kitchen, with those dear little lattice panes of glass in the window, and lots of jasmine and Virginia creeper peeping in from outside, and a green field for the laundress to dry her clothes in just beyond. Poor laundress, she will like the field awfully, and it would be very unkind of us to wish to take it away from her and give it to Mrs. Almar, for of course Mrs. Almar knows nothing about it, and the new laundress has probably arrived and set her heart on it by this time, and she may be a widow too, with lots of children." "But none of the children could be like Joe," said Maggie. "Well, perhaps not," answered Ralph. "Oh, here comes Mother. Let's run to meet her. Mother, darling, has the new laundress come?" "Yes, Ralph. She and her family arrived about an hour ago. and they are settling down nicely into the cottage and seem to be respectable people. They all think the cottage very comfortable. And are you going to see them again tonight, Auntie Violet?" asked Maggie with rather a sorrowful look in her little face. "Why, yes, Maggie, they are all strangers here, and so I fancy they rather feel that. So it might be nice to walk up presently and take a cup of tea to them. There are some children, so you and Ralph might come too. Didn't I tell you how Mother considered the poor?" here whispered Ralph, poking the little princess rather violently in the side. "Oh, yes, Mother. We'd like to go to tea with the little laundress. Is there anything we could take them? Anything they would like, to show that we sympathize with them for having come so far and having left their old home?" "They don't seem at all melancholy, Ralph," said Mrs. Greenville, smiling. "And when they have seen you and Maggie, I fancy they will none of them have anything further to desire tonight. Why, Maggie dear, you look quite sad. What's the matter?" "I'm thinking of little Jo," whispered Maggie. "Her mother is a laundress too, and she's poor. Why couldn't you have considered the poor in the shape of Jo's mother, Aunt Violet?" Mrs. Greenville stooped down and kissed Maggie. "Here comes your father and mother," she said. "I know they too want to see the new people who have come to the pretty cottage. Now let us all set off. I told the laundress and her family that you were coming to have tea with them, Maggie and Ralph. Suppose you two run on in front. You know the cottage, and you know the way." "Tell the good folks we'll look in on them presently," shouted Sir John Ascot. And then the children took each other by the hand and ran across the field to the laundress' cottage. They heard some sounds of mirth as they drew near, and saw two rather wild little boys tumbling about, turning somersaults, and standing on their heads. They also heard a high-pitched voice, and caught a glimpse of a remarkably round and red face, and it seemed to Maggie that the voice and the face were both familiar, although she could not quite recall where she had seen them before. "We must introduce ourselves quite politely," said Ralph, as they walked up the narrow garden path. "Now here we are. I'll knock with my knuckles. I wish I knew the laundress's name. It seems rude to say, 'Is the laundress in?' For, of course, she has got a name, and her name is just as valuable to her as ours is to us. How stupid not to have found out what she is really called. Perhaps we had better inquire for Mrs. Robbins. That's rather a common name, and yet not too common. It would never do to call Mrs. Smith or Jones, for if she wasn't Mrs. Smith or Jones, she wouldn't like it. Now, Maggie, I'll knock rather sharp, and when the new laundress opens the door, you are to say, 'Please, is Mrs. Robbins in?'" All this time the girl with the red face was making little darts to the lattice window and looking out, and there were some stifled sounds of mirth from the boys in the high-pitched voices. "The laundress's family are in good spirits," remarked Ralph, and then he gave a sharp little knock, and Maggie prepared her speech. "Please, is Mrs. Robb, oh, Ralph! Why, it's Mrs. Almar herself!" Nothing very coherent after this discovery was uttered by anyone for several minutes. Maggie found herself kneeling by Jo, with her arms round Jo's neck, and the two little cheeks, both wet with tears, were pressed together. In different ranks belonging almost to two extremes, the children of riches and the children of poverty knew that they possessed kindred spirits, and that their friendship was such that circumstances were not likely again to divide them. Waters was right when she said there was a strong link between Maggie and Jo. That is the story, an episode, after all, in the life of the little princess, but an episode which was to influence all her future days. The end.